on a more serious note, I always looked at, I look, I guess, at preservation as a verb. And a verb is an activity, it's active. Preservation is actually something you do. And this community has done it effectively, which is obvious by the economic engine and Main Street's Medina's ability to generate crowds and bag loads of money for this city. And that restoration began 50 years ago. And it was not done by the city. It was done by private property owners. It was done by business owners. And it was done by people who had a better idea than people, for example, that take Barberton, for example, who thought a better idea would be to tear their town down. And if you want to compare two communities, you can go stand in the Main Street in Barberton today, and you could probably play a soccer game, and you could go into overtime before you would have to get out of the way for a car, compared to what we have here today in Medina. But the restoration was done by individuals, not by the city. The city's responsibility has fallen to just one thing, and that is to protect the restoration and to continue the verb preservation. That's the city's responsibility. And you know, there's a saying, I think, of if you don't remember the past, you're bound to relive it. But maybe because the older I get, and in this instance, when we approve demolition of a seriously important building in the historic district, I'm more inclined to remember the past and have found that the now is a bit of a heartbreaker. Because the house in question is not a one-off, unimportant house. It may be one of the most important buildings in town because it is the link between two major architectural developments, Victorian and Craftsman. And that link is very hard to find. They are few and far between. And to me, even though it went through a process here, it is outrageous that that process enabled and is going to enable the demolition of this house. Since 1970, unbelievably, in the 9-block district, which is really small, dozens of buildings have been demolished. And we have a responsibility to ensure that that stops, and that one thing in particular is not allowed to happen, and that is demolition through neglect. If you buy a building, you profit from it, and you don't maintain it, then you ask for it to be demolished. That is an exact example of demolition through neglect, and it never should happen here. In 1989, when we passed and created the Historic Preservation Board, it was to protect what had been restored and what had been preserved. That was the intention of that board. And that really was the intention of the vast majority of people in this community. It wasn't about money. For example, the building that is currently Huntington, at the time was Old Phoenix. When the restoration began, they had actually had plans drawn up to build a new headquarters in the township. But once the restoration began, they decided to invest in their original building on the square at an enormous cost, and then went to Washington, D.C. and got a national award for the restoration project they did. They weren't here simply to get things done on the cheap or to make money, but they were part of the community. They were part of that movement that created what we have, and now we have a responsibility to protect it. This recent approval of demolition is probably the biggest disappointment I can imagine. Probably the biggest disappointment I've had since I've been here, because we worked for 6 years to create that historic district because we had a recalcitrant council. with parochial behavior that didn't think it was necessary to do. And you know what? It turned out it was necessary to do it, because that's the reason we have what we have. That's the reason we can have Main Street here and we can have these events. That's the reason people want to come here. People drive through this city and think, I'd like to live here. This is a city built to human scale. This is a city that's preserved. But preservation requires activity because it is a verb, and that can't be ignored. And the idea of tearing something down in this 9-block district is absolutely unacceptable. And since it went through the process, there's probably not much I can do about it. But my intention is to begin to hold public hearings on demolition in this city to try to stop any future demolition and to stop the one that's been approved now. Thank you.
Thank you. I guess everybody spoke. With that, the meeting is adjourned.